Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Ben Schreier. I'm the Executive Director of the IISS office, and I'm joined by my three colleagues from the IISS, Doug Berry, who is the Senior Fellow for Aerospace, Susana Guadera, who is a Research Associate in Defense Military Analysis Program, and last but not least, Tim Wright, who's a research associate in the program. So what we're going to discuss today, or today's topic of our webinar, is Europe's missile renaissance, which has received significant attention since the Ukraine war, given that these capabilities were extensively used on both sides of the conflict. And as a result, a number of European countries have stepped up their efforts to close gaps, including the so-called ELSA program. So what we will discuss today are some of the lessons from Ukraine, the Russian threat, an emerging, evolving threat in the space, and then the opportunities and challenges of European initiatives, particularly also the ELSA program. We will have about introductory remarks of about 25 to 30 minutes, followed by Q&A, and you can engage in the conversation by using the Q&A chat function, and then I will see those questions and I will take them and post them to our panelists. So welcome again, and without further ado, I give Susana the word. Susana.
Thank you so much, Ben. Let me just share the presentation. Great, thank you. Russia currently possesses a range of air, sea, as well as ground-launched ballistic and cruise missile systems, including those conventionally armed as well as nuclear armed, with which it is capable of striking Europe. Russia has used many of those systems in its war in Ukraine, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in my segment, give you a rundown of some of the more modern systems that Russia is using and the threat emanating from them. Now, in looking at the developments in Russian theater range missile capability, it is necessary to consider them in the context of the evolving Russian concepts of deterrence, which has increasingly in the 2000s included non-nuclear deterrence. The lessons that Russia is learning from its experience using missiles in Ukraine, and C, the aftermath of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was a treaty between the US and the Soviet Union signed in 1987, which banned a whole class of missiles, ground-launched systems between 500 and 5,500 kilometers of range, from which the US ultimately withdrew, citing sustained Russian non-compliance. And in part because of the INF Treaty, the bulk of Russia's conventional precision strike capability has been formed by sea and air launch systems. Russia has a diverse inventory of such systems. These include more modern systems as well as some older Soviet-era models. Some of the newer missiles, which Russia has extensively used in Ukraine, include the naval caliber land attack cruise missile, as well as the KH-101 air-launched cruise missile. Russia has now also introduced its Zircon missile, which is capable of traveling at hypersonic speeds. Although it was primarily introduced into service as an anti-ship missile, it also has a secondary land attack mode, and it has been tested against land targets in Ukraine. Russia has now also introduced a air-launched ballistic missile, the Kinjal, which it has also used in Ukraine with varying levels of success. Now, moving on to ground-launched systems. Currently, Russia's ground-launch capability, at least in the theater range, is primarily comprised of systems with a claimed maximum range of about 500 kilometers. That includes the Iskander-M SRBM, as well as the 9M728 Southpaw Glickam. But as I mentioned, Russia has developed and deployed the 9M729 screwdriver subsonic broad mobile Glickam, which is the missile which the US identified as the reason for leaving the INF treaty. Has a range of some 2,500 kilometers. As you can see, that covers most of Europe. You see the Rubiage IRBM in this map as well, but there is one system that is missing, and that is the Oryeshnik. The US Department of Defense describes the Oryeshnik as an intermediate range ballistic missile. It garnered quite a bit of international attention. It was fired on the 21st of November from the Astrakhan Oblast in Russia at the Pivdin-Mash defense plant in Dnipro in Ukraine. It flew about 800 kilometers. Russia described this launch as a field test. This is still relatively new, but there are some open source information emerging about the Oryeshnik. From the imagery, it appears that it carried 6 warheads or submunition dispensers with 6 submunitions each. Vladimir Putin said that this was not a strategic weapon. That is, it is not meant for nuclear warhead delivery, but rather a high-precision one, which is what is required of a conventionally armed weapon. The missile may have been based on the Rubiage IRBM. This was developed in the early 2010s and then subsequently shelved around 2017, 2018. Putin also mentioned there are similar systems currently undergoing testing. So where does this leave us? Russia claims that it is maintaining the self-imposed moratorium on the deployment of INF-class missile systems for as long as the US and European NATO allies do the same. However, we know that the US has already announced that it's going to be deploying INF-class conventionally armed systems to Germany beginning in 2026. And potential deployment options for Russia include the 9M729 screwdriver Glickam, which I've already mentioned, as well as the Oryeshnik IRBM, which Putin has said will be ready for deployment in the second half of 2025. Another option may also include a ground-launched version of the Zircon missile, which the British intelligence has assessed that Russia may have likely adopted a coastal defense system for launching this type of missile from the ground. Further down the line, one of the overarching lessons that are emerging from Ukraine is that speed matters for survivability. Ballistic missiles and other supersonic missile systems have performed better in terms of interception rates than subsonic systems. As such, we might see more ballistic missile developments, as we're already seeing with the Oryeshnik. We might also see a redoubled effort on Russia's part to develop high supersonic and hypersonic cruise missiles. For example, the KH-95, which is reportedly under development as a hypersonic outcome. The second lesson is that basing matters as well. Sea and air launch systems were less survivable than ground launch ones. This might be in part because Ukraine was able to spot bombers and vessels moving from their bases, was able to react swiftly. This is much harder to do, set tracking with ground launch systems. And the final lesson is that quantity matters. At the outset of the war, Russia was not able to prosecute Ukrainian targets sufficiently. It was launching smaller salvos, more sparsely. Perhaps that's because they thought it wasn't necessary in what was supposed to be a 3-day war. Perhaps it was because of the insufficient inventory depth. We know that Russia has since intensified missile attacks on Ukraine, launching more missiles more often. And it seems that Russia is also bolstering its missile manufacturing capability. My colleague Fabian Hinz recently wrote a blog post highlighting how Russia is expanding and refurbishing its solid propellant motor manufacturing plants. So in sum, Russia already operates and has told us it's working on more long-range precision strike capabilities. That obviously constitutes a threat to European NATO allies who are looking to develop analogous capabilities, which my colleagues will detail for you. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Doug.
Thanks, Liz. Good day, everyone. I'm going to do a very quick canter through where the Europeans now are in terms of air-launched land attack cruise missile capability, how we got here, and where we might go in the coming decade or so. A fundamental component of air power is reach. It's made increasingly effective by speed. That gives you the capacity to attack an enemy's centre of gravity at considerable range. Now, in the UK, the RAF uses the language of attack. It's one of the 4 primary roles of air power. It also uses the language of strategic attack, and we may or may not want to get into the question of is there ever such a thing as a strategic air power? There's certainly such a thing as air interdiction, and again, I think this is where we saw renewed interest in conventional air-launched cruise missiles come into being. In terms of how it really started, you see a combination of technological development and military requirement coalesce in the 1970s and into the early 1980s. Those of you who are of an age with me will remember things like NATO's follow-on forces attack and the US Army's 1980s airline battle doctrine. And within these, there is a concept of deep attack. In fact, with follow-on forces attack, the depth of attack was some 800 kilometres was the target goal. With the kind of systems, an accuracy between 1 and 10 metres CEP. Deep battle was kind of seen as 500 kilometres plus. One of the things that comes out of this in 1982 is a NATO feasibility study with the catchy title of NGAST 1236, which included West Germany, the UK and the US. This was for a conventional-only long-range weapon. How this comes into being really is you have a capability emerges around the capacity to miniaturise guidance and propulsion. So you get the 2 key elements, if you like, of a land attack cruise missile, which can be conventional rather than nuclear, because obviously miss distance is less of an issue if you have several kilotons at the front of your weapon. NGAST 1236 by the mid-1980s morphs into something called the NATO Long Range Standoff Missile, LRSOM. This is a range of around 600 kilometres, which I think is capped because of the SALT agreement. In 1986, it then becomes part of a 7-nation MSOW programme. MSOW lasts 3 years. Unfortunately, with many multilateral programmes, it didn't actually see the light of day. It collapsed in 1989. What it does leave us with, though, in the UK is what becomes Staff Requirement Air 1236. This is put in motion in 1993, and by 1997, Marjorie BAE Dynamics, as then was selected to develop the system. What we now know as Storm Shadow in the UK, Scalp EG in France. In terms of what this gives you, those are just very rough, unrefueled combat radius of a Tornado GR4 with Storm Shadow, either operating out of the UK as home base or in Germany. So you can see the kind of coverage that it gives you. Obviously, where we are today, in a sense, is Storm Shadow and Scalp EG have been provided to the Ukrainians, integrated on a very small number of Su-24 fencers, but have been proving pretty capable. However, what we also see is the vulnerability of subsonic cruise missiles when faced with credible air defence. The missile with the gent whose face is obscured, we assume is the Russian. That is either a Storm Shadow or a Scalp. And the inset picture, you can actually see the Brooch warhead. The picture on the other side of that slide is a Ka-101, so AS-23 Kodiak. Again, looks to have come down pretty intact in a field. So subsonic systems can be vulnerable if you're faced by credible air defences. Where will we be tomorrow? Two options. As Zeus mentioned, speed is certainly one. The other option is very low observable. And the complement to both of those is obviously you don't go in alone in terms of how you try to deal with the defence. In the way that the Russians have been using the Garand family of very low cost one-way attack UAVs to try and swamp defences, wherein you put in the much higher cost K101 in the hope that you can get it through to the target. I think we'll see much more of this kind of mix and match approach combined with certainly high supersonic weapons, so Mach 4, Mach 4.5, and indeed hypersonic weapons which are Mach 5 and above. And with that, I will hand over to Tim.
Thank you, Douglas. So my colleagues have discussed Russia, of course, has used ballistic and cruise missiles in its war against Ukraine, and also thinking about some European NATO member states, they have insufficient depth and flexibility of their precision strike stockpiles. So what this has done essentially is it's galvanized some European NATO members to consider acquiring new capabilities, especially in the ground launch area. And there are multiple lines of effort underway. One is the planned deployment of US conventional missiles to Germany beginning in 2026. As you can see on this map, depending on the system, which are on the right-hand side there, some of these will be able to reach the Kaliningrad Oblast, whereas others will be able to strike targets deeper inside Belarus and Western Russia from launch points in Germany. The current plans for this, though, however, only call for a very small number of missiles to be deployed. The total number is only around 1/8 of the number of missiles the US deployed to Germany in the 1980s, and all of these systems will be conventional armed rather than armed with nuclear warheads. European NATO members are also independently procuring surface-to-surface capabilities, however, with 13 countries already possessing these types of systems and nearly 20 states with orders on the books. However, these are mostly of short-range guided rocket artillery with ranges less than 100 kilometres, which therefore doesn't provide you with the ability to strike targets in depth. Now, a much more ambitious approach is a new joint effort known as the European Long-Range Strike Approach, or ELSA, which is what Ben mentioned at the beginning. The purpose of ELSA is for European states to collaboratively develop a ground-launched conventional missile with a range over 1,000 kilometres. No European NATO member has ever possessed a conventional system, and the point is about conventional system of such a long range. France did possess an intermediate-range ballistic missile called the S-3 until 1997, but it was nuclear-armed. ELSA has the potential to improve NATO's defence and deterrence postures in Europe. However, there are political, technical and budgetary challenges associated with co-development that will need to be addressed if this approach is to bear fruit. Well, so far, 6 European NATO members have joined ELSA: France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Sweden and the UK. The intention is for it to be open as widely as possible, and it's possible that other countries may join the project later. Now, no official performance criteria has been released, but comments from officials suggest that a ground-launched cruise missile with a range between 1,000 to 2,000 kilometres and an in-service date by the 2030s is planned. As Doug said, while multiple European NATO members possess air and sea-launched missiles, none possess ground-launched systems with a range greater than 300 kilometres. In a future conflict, the air and maritime security environment may be contested, and NATO forces may have constrained targeting options as a result. Investing in ground launch options therefore provides military planners with additional flexible options for conducting long-range precision strike. Now, also participants have made clear that the new missile must be produced in Europe, and so therefore adapting a European air or sea launch system for ground launch will likely be simpler and faster than designing an entirely new missile. There are challenges with this approach, however, notably that no in-service European-designed air-launched cruise missile, such as the Storm Shadow previously mentioned, or Taurus, the German-Swedish collaboration, fulfills ELSA's envisaged 1,000 to 2,000 kilometre range requirement. Now, unless this is reduced or a non-European option is considered, the only candidate system that's already been designed and produced in Europe is MBDA France's sea-launched cruise missile known as the MDCM. Fortuitously ahead of the ELSA announcement, MBDA France proposed developing a ground-launched version of that missile with a very inventive name called the Land the land cruise missile, or the LCM. The MDCN and presumably also the LCM are both subsonic LACM with a range of more than 1,000 kilometres, and it also incorporates a low observable design. MBDA's proposition in many ways is presenting a fait accompli given the lack of suitable European alternatives. But there is a question of whether a subsonic ground-launched cruise missile would suitably meet participants' capability requirements for the next several decades. Evidence from the war in Ukraine, as Susanna has pointed out, that analogous Russian systems, such as the Kar-101, have been intercepted in large numbers by ground-based air defences. Whether the current generation of LACMs will still have sufficient military utility into the 2040s and possibly the 2050s, if we judge by how long Storm Shadow has been in service, is therefore uncertain. A supersonic or a very low observable design may therefore be a more attractive long-term option for European needs, but this would increase development costs and also the time. And because ELSA participants intend to develop a new capability within adequate time, cost and volume, this approach is probably therefore not feasible. Beyond military utility, co-development raises political, technical and budgetary challenges. And one challenge of co-development will be jointly developing a system that fulfills the potentially diverging military requirements of all of the ELSA participants. As I say, there are 6 now, that may increase further later. Managing the defence industrial interests of the different stakeholders will also present another challenge, especially if participants cannot agree on work shares, where parts are built, and so on. In terms of scope, while joint development may lower design and production costs beyond the 6 countries that have already signed up, there are few European NATO members with sufficient defence budgets and industrial bases, especially geared towards the production of precision-guided weaponry, to substantially support ELSA both financially and technically. Now, none of these challenges, of course, are insurmountable, but they are a reminder that development of complex defence equipment with multiple participants requires stakeholders to address multiple challenges. Many ambitious European projects have collapsed or suffered from significant delays due to irreconcilable technical or industrial differences between participants. Given Europe's challenging security environment and also the desire for European NATO member states to fulfil capability gaps quickly and cheaply, European countries would do well to avoid these pitfalls. I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for these excellent 3 short presentations to lead into the topic. So now is the time for your questions and comments using the chat function. We have about 38 minutes or so. And maybe just starting with the first 3. One question is whether there are any credible indicators on the accuracy of that Russian Oreshnik conventional IRBM that Susanna mentioned, and maybe in relations to the Oreshnik, another question is, do we have any knowledge about how Russia managed to develop that capability so quickly, or has this been also years in the making? But maybe we start with the Oreshnik.
Great. Shall I go first?
Who wants to start?
I can start, yeah. I can give you a few words about the potential origin of the Oreshnik. So the short answer is we don't really know all that much at the moment. We have not been told exactly how it was developed. Vladimir Putin says that it is a new missile model. And we also know that since around June 2023, Russia has been telling us that they are looking to accelerate the development of INF-class missiles. We also know that Russia has developed the Rubiež IRBM about 10 or 12 years ago. Eventually, this was shelved in around 2017 or 2018. And it is entirely possible that it was taken out of storage, and perhaps the booster of that missile was used, and then some changes were made to the very front of that missile. Since it's already a ready main design that has been tested. Oreshnik could also be based on an ICBM. This is something that Russia has done in the past, including with the SS-20 Pioneer IRBM, which was the missile at the very core of the Euro-missile crisis. This was based on an ICBM. Rubiež itself was also based on the Topol and Yars ICBM families. So these are the potential origins. It is a very short timeline for a development of an entirely new system like this. So it is very likely that it is based on something else. Do you guys
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly on Rubesh, I think it was the last but one state defence plan where it was shelved pretty much after development was near complete. So as Zeus said in the latter part of the 2010s. I don't know if Tim or Zeus had any thoughts on accuracy. I think everything, obviously we've been looking at in open source is what we've all seen, which is the footage of what appeared to be the submunitions at the end going in. By the look of the pattern, it's not a particularly accurate spread, but again, the difficulty is you're looking at it from probably only one or two directions, so actually getting a sense of that pattern spread is in question. And obviously the Ukrainians understandably have been loath to say anything about the extent of the damage, if indeed any. Tim?
Yeah, on the question of accuracy, with it being a submunition, of course, which is then suitable for area targets, its accuracy is going to be different. It's going to be a bit more difficult to assess when thinking about just as a weapon with a single warhead. As Douglas said, looking at the video footage, the spread pattern is quite large. Frustratingly, we haven't been able to see any good satellite imagery of the site, which was struck due to poor weather all the way since November. So we are checking fairly regularly to see if we can then make any sort of assessments of the damage. But then there's been very poor weather over Dnipro, which has then prevented us from actually being able to look at the factory buildings.
Good. So there's another question on operational concepts and targeting, and that question is sort of threefold. One is, how do you expect Russian non-nuclear deterrence to evolve? And conversely, what about doctrinal operational concepts of European countries, or is it sort of a classical wag the dog, where technologies precede doctrinal operational concept development?
So I think on that question there, I mean, I think the cart is before the horse in terms of technology preceding the doctrine. I mean, it's clear, I think, as well, that even the system is not clearly defined right now. I mean, like I say, we've not had any sort of official news in the communique about what they want to develop beyond a ground launch system. When announcing Sweden's participation in the project, for example, the Swedish defense minister said, gave some details about it. He then later spoke to media and said that Sweden isn't very interested in developing a ground launch system, but wants an air or sea launched one. But ELSA is meant to develop a ground launch system. So I think even there is a little bit of confusion, and I think amongst the partners there will be quite a lot of discussion going on behind the scenes of what exactly it is they want to develop. And then the bigger question then will probably be, well, how do we want to use it? And I think, despite the statement that ELSA, the purpose of ELSA is to open it up as widely as possible, I do then wonder, is that going to be absolutely every European NATO member who could join, or is there going to be a point where they might say, well, actually, you're located too far into Eastern Europe, that might be too worrying to the Russians, for example? I mean, is it going to be open to everyone, or is there going to be some restriction? I think there will be questions around targeting as well. Can this only be used to strike targets in sort of Russia's western region or in the Leningrad military district? Can this target any further? What are they going to be going after, etc.? I think all of those things are probably still under discussion and will have to be figured out later. Because like I say, even now, they don't even seem particularly clear on what type of system it is they want to develop. So, yeah, I think the cart is before the horse there.
Yes?
Yeah, just to maybe add a little bit on the Russian side. How do we expect Russia's non-nuclear deterrence to evolve? Well, Russia at the beginning of its war in Ukraine didn't exactly adhere to its own doctrine of non-nuclear deterrence, which effectively states that Russia will prosecute key critical targets very quickly in a dosed manner to achieve a quick victory on terms favorable to Russia. That has not happened, and I think the war in Ukraine has shown that missiles are not necessarily by themselves just war-winning weapons, even if you do scale up their employment by quite a bit. They have a psychological effect, but they not necessarily, especially in the presence of credible air and missile defense, they don't win wars on their own. So I think that in the future, Russia might increase its reliance and emphasis on nuclear deterrence. Sort of go back to that. We have already seen an inkling on that with the revised Russian nuclear doctrine, which sort of emphasizes that aspect. But yeah, I think that's what's going to be the trajectory of travel for Russia.
Just a couple of very brief thoughts on that. I think generally, I think none of us would be surprised to see post the Ukrainian campaign, however that ends, a kind of review on the part of the Russians as to how things went. I mean, we saw that after Georgia. We had Novi Oblik, where there was a considerable period of study and reflection, and then some considerable changes to how they went about business, as it were. I think the interesting challenge, in a sense, for them, and Zuzana alluded to it, is the kind of comparative limited lack of success they've had in many areas in terms of the air-launched, certainly the conventional air-launched cruise missiles and the maritime equivalents, both in terms of the numbers that they've lost through air defence and also their comparative lack of adequate ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance to support the use of such systems. I mean, in terms of their geospatial into the moment, pretty limited. They probably only got a handful of electro-optical satellites in operation at the moment. And obviously this is a hindrance in terms of your targeting cycle, both in its speed and actually what you can cover. So I think generally there's going to be, I would be very surprised if there isn't a kind of a long, hard look at their failings, of which there are many, as they reconsider the kind of balance between conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. Somewhat uncomfortably, obviously, as a European, in the near term at least, this probably means greater reliance on nuclear capabilities.
Great. Let's move and maybe take 3 sets of questions. The first one relates to what needs to happen for Europe to catch up with Russia's speed of missile production. That probably might relate to, not just to manufacturing capabilities, but maybe, as was said, for instance, ELSA is supposed to be producing results in the 2030s, and maybe by that time it might already be too late. Another question I think which might be interesting to discuss here has been posed in regards to why all of these developments will be different from the first Euro missile crisis, referring to the dual use problem posed by Russia, where its missiles will also be deployed or equipped with nuclear warheads. So are we facing actually another Euro missile crisis? And if so, how can we avoid it? And maybe the last question in this round is a bit more technical, which relates to the question of what the thinking is around surveillance and targeting systems needed to make ELSA effective. So are there parallel space and airborne systems which need to be developed and improved?
Why don't you start? We'll just walk down the line, pick
Thanks, Ben. So on the question on Europe to catch up, I think really the challenge here is that Europe probably isn't going to catch up in the sense of Russia in terms of it producing matching numbers of missiles. Raduga, which is Russia's main sort of cruise missile house, that has 3 shifts a day. The plant is running 6 days a week. The way the Russians are going at this is they are throwing a lot of people and resources at this. I think in a way that just European countries will not, unless we're in a conflict. I think though more sort of practical ways for us to do this will certainly be to increase inventory depth in the future. So when it comes to procurement of ELSA and then also procurement of other systems which are planned, FCAS-W, for example, the UK, French, Italian coordination to develop a replacement for Storm Shadow. I think when you think that the numbers that we bought in the 1990s and early 2000s, UK bought around 900 Storm Shadow, France around 800, those numbers will just need to be a lot bigger in the future, I think, in order then to have then large numbers of them over several decades. I think also there might then be a need for keeping production lines warm, so you can re-ramp production up again. This seems to have been a problem with whether we could supply Ukraine with additional missiles. It's been a problem with the Americans, whether they could give the Ukrainians more ATACMS, for example, the short-range ballistic missile, where one of the key challenges facing the Americans giving the Ukrainians large numbers is the Americans have stopped production of the system, and they have their own stockpile numbers that they have to consider as well. There might also be a reconsideration as well as making more sort of cheaper missiles, and maybe my colleague Susanna would want to talk about this, where European countries might look at producing systems which have lower costs, and therefore you can produce in large numbers. I mean, Storm Shadow costs of more than £1 million per system, whilst you might not want to produce something that is very cheap and therefore quite unreliable. There might be a method to approach it like the Russians have done. Douglas mentioned around the Goran, for instance, which is essentially sort of a bit of a blend between a one-way attack munition and a cruise missile, and that's produced at a fraction of the cost. Of course, its warhead is much lighter and it doesn't cause then as much damage to the target, but still it's another way of potentially boosting production numbers there. I'll pass over then to Susan, to Douglas.
Yeah, in terms of what needs to happen for Europe to catch up, as Tim has just said, cheaper missiles that are able to be mass produced are going to be potentially very important for this future effort. Doug has just let me know that one Storm Shadow costs about £2.5 million.
Double what I was thinking there.
Oh, sorry. And in the US has been looking quite a lot at cooperating and working with some of the up-and-coming industry players on basically conceptualizing and producing cheaper cruise missiles, which might use commercially available off-the-shelf components, which means that they're able to be put together much more quickly. The other thing is, as Tim previously mentioned, that some countries in Europe have much more experience and know-how producing. They have much bigger industries, especially in the cruise missile domain, and some of them don't. And so, in the moving forward, there's going to be quite a bit of importance placed on just know-how sharing, just upskilling and making sure that other countries can take part of the burden and open their own production lines, etc. So that's Doug?
Yeah, very briefly. There's a question on why would this crisis look any different, if indeed it is a crisis, from the original Euromissile crisis. I think the thing that strikes me most about is the difference in internal politics in Western countries. There is nowhere near the level of public debate or concern, certainly as yet, with regard to any deployment. And I think that may well be down to the fact that generally, given Russian activity in Ukraine, there is a recognition of the kind of what is a very uncomfortable security environment, which I think was different to that in the 1980s, in the sense that there was a potential, at least, for accommodation, which was kind of seen in the wider public. I don't know that there is at the moment that kind of potential for accommodation, so there's more of perhaps an acceptance that deployments will be required. In terms of catching up, I don't know that I'd kind of buy into the language of catching up. I think it's more about being able to present credible conventional deterrence to the Russians, and how do you do that? Like Tim mentioned, manufacturing capacity. I think we now see language around things like always on, where you have the ability to crank the handle a bit more. And as Susanna mentioned, more of a mix and match approach, where you're going to have a high-low mix in terms of cost and performance. You're going to look to flood defences, overwhelm them. So you use very low-cost systems, basically to provide a kind of a recognised air picture, which is just for the targets, which you will have to honour. And if you're honouring those with expensive SAMs, that has a value in its own right. And very briefly, finally, on the question on surveillance, I think there's a general trend for this to go to geospatial, in part because of coverage, in part, perhaps ironically, because of reduced vulnerability. Air-breathing systems are increasingly vulnerable, especially when you look at extended range missile engagement zones of the kind of double-digit SAMs and what we see coming down the pipe. So you therefore head to space, not without its vulnerabilities, but you know, hopefully a more effective way, at least at the outset of any conflict, of dealing with it. And then, absolutely finally, the other element of that, of course, is the targeting cycle. The Russians have come up short in both in Ukraine, and I think there is generally a recognition that as the whole target set, whichever side you're on, moves much more towards certainly relocatable, if not mobile, then your targeting cycle has to get faster. Ben.
Great. Another set of three. First question relates to Turkey, which, as we know, is one of the few NATO member states capable of actually building cruise and ballistic missiles. Have you come across any indications, you know, what Turkey's possible role might be in, you know, European collaboration on long-range strike? Second question, what evidence, if any, is there that China and Russia might actually be collaborating on the development of a long-range conventional missile with MIRV capacity? And last in this round, I think we take the question of what role, again, a more technical question, what role could EW play in denying the use of such missile systems that we have discussed? So Turkey, Russia, China, and the role of EW.
Yeah. So on Russian-China collaboration, I don't think I've seen anything in the open source that indicates that they are collaborating on producing a system as has been described. Bearing in mind, of course, that China already has a range of different systems, has a variety of different systems across the range threshold for conventional strike, including to the upper end of the IRBM bracket. The most recent China military power report also talks about China maybe developing a conventional range ICBM as well. So it seems that China is doing this stuff on its own already. And then, of course, with Oreshnik, there's still a lot of information that we don't know about it regarding its range, but it seems that there are independent national projects that are ongoing, but I've not seen or read anything about potential collaboration between the two. And bearing in mind that they both have very developed and capable ballistic missile defense production industries, whether they would need to collaborate, I'm not so sure if they would need to. On Turkey's role in ELSA, I think that's a good question, and I think that's probably a question that ELSA participants may be thinking of whether Turkey wants to be involved or not. If it would be, though, I think the area that it probably would be most involved would be if there was to be a ballistic missile rather than a cruise missile. I think European, Western European design houses particularly are in a stronger position than Turkey is when it comes to turbofan, turbojet engines and the like. Turkey, of course, has got several anti-ship missiles that it's developed indigenously. It's also looking at developing a long-range cruise missile called Gezgin, but these projects are much further behind than their Western equivalents. So I think Turkey's role, if it was going to be involved to be in ELSA, would be down the ballistic pathway, where it does have much more experience through Rokistan. I think the problem with that approach, though, is a ballistic missile envisaged or not? And I have seen there is another question in the chat about whether European countries would produce a ballistic missile or not. I think within the ELSA framework as it's been put, currently it doesn't look like that's the case. But then ELSA is, it's suitably vague that it could potentially include a ballistic missile. I just think the problem, though, with that approach is Beyond Turkey, there's very little experience in Europe developing ballistic missiles of these ranges. Lots of these companies have experience building shorter range battlefield rockets. France, of course, has Ariane Group, which makes the M51 SLBM missions. But finding something that's in the sort of the upper end of the short range ballistic missile, or the lower end of the medium range ballistic missile threshold, is just something that European sort of manufacturers haven't had much experience with. So I just can't see the ballistic missile approach right now being the sort of the foreseeable one, considering this is a capability gap that they want to plug urgently. EW, I'll leave that alone. It's not my topic, so I'll pass that down the line. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just to add, as Tim says, in terms of Turkey's possible role, I've not heard anything either, but as he says, it will probably, if anything, be a ballistic missile project or cooperation on that front. One thing to note is that Turkey has, to the best of my knowledge, not sold any of its ballistic missiles to European NATO allies, who continue to rely primarily on US and some Israeli MLRS systems as well. So there hasn't been that much cooperation there.
I'll just say a few words on electronic warfare, or electromagnetic warfare, as perhaps we now see used more often. It absolutely has a role to play, and probably an increasing one, in terms of getting your cruise missiles through the target, either with the weapon itself having some kind of jamming or defensive aids capability. We've obviously seen decoys on Iskander, and the Cat-101, the Kodiak certainly has both IR and chaff dispensers, so the missiles themselves have a defensive capability to try and punch through the sand belts, if you like, and then you can obviously have a dedicated system. The UK, as part of its Spear family, is Spear 3EW, which will kind of behave as a kind of stand-in jammer for a kind of, not exactly a swarm, but a grouping of missiles as they try to get through the defensive belts. And you'll see that also with the low-cost one-way attack UAVs, where there is either no explosive payload or a small explosive payload, but combined with some kind of electronic warfare to jam, or indeed, a pacifier F-Seeker where the weapon itself just homes on the emissions of the air defence radar. So I think all of these things are going to be much more in play to try and get inside contested airspace and to deal with multiple layers of ground-based air defence. Okay.
Good. Another next round of three, or maybe I even bundle some more together. So one is, Tim, you mentioned that at the moment there is no indicators that European countries also want to develop ballistic missiles. But if there were, how long would we assess that might take? Secondly, regarding there was a question about Poland, what Poland is thinking about its missile capabilities, and that maybe could be tied to another question which has been raised in the chat, which is there another state in Europe beside Germany which would be or might accept American deployments of INF range non-nuclear missiles? And I would add then, could that be Poland? More technical question related to ISR capability. Could you comment on the efforts underway among some European NATO members to not only just strengthen their missile capabilities, but also ISR to reduce their reliance on the United States? And last but not least, very good, also probably inevitable question, whether you had any thoughts on missile defense, and whether missile defenses, could reduce some of the vulnerabilities, but of course would also require significant increases in production. So development times, Poland, ISR, and missile defense.
On the cheap missile question, I mean, there's the Project Breakstop in the UK. The aim of that is to develop cheaper munitions. I think the cost of which is around £400,000 or so. So there is clearly some thinking in NATO countries about trying to develop cheaper munitions. There's loyal wingman schemes as well, which these sort of multi-effectors, which may have EW components or may have a sort of smaller munition inside of them. So I think there is this idea around developing sort of smaller, cheaper systems, but I think it's probably going to require a little bit of a rethink to some Western defense companies who typically do think more in the sort of the slightly more Gucci kit than the sort of the cheaper stuff which we're seeing the Russians using. On the length of time to develop a ballistic missile, I mean, yeah, it's a difficult question. I'd say probably you're going to guess at least a decade though. Probably the easier thing to do is just to procure this from an ally, the United States being an obvious one, especially when you consider how many European NATO members operate the HIMARS and the M270 launchers, the precision strike missile PrISM. One of the variants of that increment 4 will have a range of around 1,000 kilometres. That will probably fill the gap quite nicely, and it will be available quicker than it will be if a European country were to develop it. But that's not to say they shouldn't, but it's just an alternative. If another state would accept, I mean, I'm sure my colleagues will have thoughts on this, but I mean, Poland, I think, is the likely one. I think the problem with this approach, though, is that there's only a limited number of multi-domain task forces. The US only has 5. One is slated for Europe, one's slated for CENTCOM's area responsibility. One will be in the United States, and 2 will be in the Asia Pacific. Unless the United States significantly increases the number of launch missiles it produces and develops more MGTFs, that will be a problem going forward. There might be political will, but is there actually the systems there? And reducing reliance on US ISR. Yep, I agree, and I think that's a trend that we're seeing elsewhere. We're seeing it in South Korea and Japan, for instance, which as they're developing their own, in Japan they call them counter-strike capabilities, and in South Korea they're sort of their 3K deterrence architecture. They're also wanting to have the independent capability to detect, track, target, conduct battle damage assessment, and so on. I think that's probably an area that European countries may also be thinking of in the future, especially if we have similar fears of abandonment. If the United States is always going to be thinking about security in the same way, especially with the incoming Trump administration. I'll pass over to Susanna.
Thank you so much. I can say a few words about Poland. Poland has definitely doubled down on its emphasis on developing a long-range precision strike capability, especially since the onset of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Poland has since moved to acquire, for example, the naval strike missile, which is an anti-ship missile with a secondary land attack capability. They're, I believe, looking or have already signed a contract to buy several hundred of those. Similar with JASM-ER, the extended range variant of JASM. That's about, I think, 930 kilometers. Again, signed a contract to acquire several hundred to be delivered from 2026. Poland has ATACMS. It has also contracts with Arrow K for the K239 Chunmoo MLRS, as well as the Korean Tactical Surface-to-Surface Missile Block 2, which is a 290-kilometer range CRBM. It has previously expressed a interest in acquiring the Tomahawk LACM perhaps for its submarine program, which I am not entirely sure whether that has ever officially formally been made, that request to the US. I'm frankly not sure how it would have been received. But this is to say, yes, Poland is very much interested in acquiring a robust and large precision strike capability. Whether it would be interested in hosting US INF-class missiles, as Tim said, probably. There's probably political will to do that. Apart from considerations of numbers, whether the US has enough, I think one thing that's worth considering too is whether it is a good idea to put those missiles so close to the front line. In Poland, depending on where, but they would be much more vulnerable to Russian systems, including those stationed in Kaliningrad. So that's another consideration. On missile defense, the question features a very central thing, which is if suitable systems of different capabilities and numbers are deployed. That's a big if, and that's where we get into the question of cost. And I think that increasingly the idea of shooting the archer rather than the arrow is relevant. And that's where the offensive capabilities come in, which we obviously been talking about.
Yeah, just very briefly, where else might the US put their missiles besides Germany? It was the UK first time around, so I don't think it's inconceivable that the Brits might be willing second time around as well. In terms of ISR, space-based systems, I think there's a general recognition amongst a number of European countries they need to do more, including the UK. The UK on a number of occasions has got kind of close to trying to get back into the space business on the military side of the house. Previously, never quite made it through the funding hurdle. This time it has. There are multiple efforts underway, and I think you'll see that kind of behaviour replicated in a number of European countries. The challenge is that along with space, and space will become ever more important, you probably still want some air-breathing stuff. Whether that is disposable, attritable, or exquisite depends on the kind of price points you're willing to bear, and whether or not you're willing to lose as many of them as you might in a highly contested environment. And just on missile defence, I think even before the Europeans get their heads round ballistic missile defence, I think pretty inadequate when it comes to cruise missile defence. And the Europeans face a 360-degree threat in terms of subsonic land attack cruise missiles. And I think that is probably a first step that needs to be far more adequately addressed before we even begin to think about BMD. I'll leave it at that, Ben.
Thank you. So we are unfortunately running out of time very quickly. So time for two more quick questions that I take from this, from the chat. One is, what is your assessment on a possible role for the United States or US defense industry in ELSA? Is there any, how could that look like? And secondly, could there be a possible market for an export variant of ELSA in the future, which could help to bring down the cost, or is this too early to say? So US role in ELSA and export variant.
I think maybe with the US role in ELSA is probably going to be very limited because the European countries have said specifically that they want to develop a sovereign solution, that they've made the fact that it's got to be European a central point to that. So I think that that there's probably going to be only a small role for the United States or none at all. And if the missile that they do develop is the LCM, I mean, that is a French designed system, French produced system, and that immediately sort of shuts the US out. In terms of a market for an export variant, I just can't. I mean, considering the range requirement is between 1,000 and 2,000 kilometers, if the warhead is going to be anywhere near the toward 500 kilograms, you're getting into MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime, Cap 1 territory, which then just makes the export of that system pretty difficult to do. So I think probably based on its range, it's probably not going to be a system that you're going to be seeing exported outside of Europe. There might certainly be interest from countries, perhaps in the Middle East and elsewhere, but I just can't see it right now. But that is bearing in mind if the MTCR still exists in sort of 5-10 years, which isn't perhaps a given considering all the missile proliferation we are seeing from Iran to Russia, North Korea to Russia, etc. So who's to say that club will still exist? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add on the Asia Pacific, there probably will be interest. I can imagine Korea, of course, Japan, Australia are all very much interested in bolstering their precision strike capability. Having procured, for example, Japan and Australia Tomahawks from the US. So there's probably going to be interest, and as Tim says, this will depend very much on what kind of norms, whether the MTCR is still around, and just how strong it is?
Yeah, I mean, Tim mentioned European sovereign capability with regard to ELSA. I couldn't disagree there. I think that both in terms of the weapon itself and the ISR and targeting capabilities, I think that given the language that's been used around ELSA, that US industrial involvement at any kind of significant level would seem to me to be particularly difficult. And I'd probably take a slightly kind of more or darker view of exports, and I think that it's not impossible that should ELSA come into being, that at least some favoured countries might actually have access to it in the fullness of time. I'll leave it at that. Hey.
Excellent. So 1600 here in Berlin sharp. That means, unfortunately, we have to draw this to a close. I'm sure that everyone around this virtual room will join me in thanking our three excellent speakers for shining some light on the strategic, the political, the technical dimensions of this very complicated but also important topic for European and transatlantic defense. I also commend to you some of the recent analysis that we have done on this topic, which you can find on our website. Thanks to everyone for posing excellent questions. I tried to pose all of those to our speakers. So stay tuned because we will continue to work on this very important topic. And thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.